Now.
I did. So I switched it off. I had a lot of pings of emails coming through, so I've gone out of it, turned them off, and then I'm going to reshare the screen now. Right, so hopefully you can see that again now. Fab, I can see you nodding. Thank you very much. Right, okay, so welcome then to this next module for the Masters. So this is ALN Excellence in Practice, or anghenion dysgu ychwanegol rhagoriaeth mewn ymarfer. And in terms of the cohort for this module, there's a little bit of a mixed group, really. So some of you have done the inclusive classroom practice module in term 1, and then have come back to do this one in term 3. Some people in the group did the leadership and management of ALN module I finished last month and are carrying on with this one. And then I think there's 1 or 2 people who might have done one of the kind of the equity and diversity modules, for example, and they're doing a bit more of a mix and match. So I think it's a really interesting cohort together. It would be nice at some point, and we'll talk about this later as well, to try and get everyone to meet up as a group and use each other in terms of that peer support moving forward as well. So just want to make people aware then as to who you would be working with going through the module. So obviously myself, that's quite an old photo now, but that myself based at Swansea. You will have come to some of the National Saturdays before, and some of these people on screen at least will be recognisable potentially. So thinking about the National Saturdays, myself, I'll be there representing Swansea. But we've got Rhiannon and Anne, for example, who will be joining us from Cardiff Met, Laura from Wrexham, Nana from Trinity St David's, Carmel from South Wales, and then coming along the bottom, Fliss from Bangor, Anne, as you said, from Cardiff, and Megan from Aberystwyth, and then me as the random man from Swansea in that lineup. So going forward, I'll be the tutor at Swansea that we'll be working closely together with, but we will be working with all these other people on the screen during those National Conference Saturdays. So what are we going to cover today? So realistically, I suppose the key thing that I wanted to mention is the assessment process. And when we look at the assignment for this module, in one hand, I think it looks quite complicated. And it's one that's quite easy to overthink. And then when we break it down a little bit, very often the response is, oh, it wasn't as bad as I thought it sounded. Now, I know that's not selling it particularly well, but I will go through that in a second, if that's okay. So we'll focus a bit more on the assignment. Now, these slides are kind of generic across the 7 universities. You will have seen this kind of slide or a version of it in your other module as well. So where can you get tips from in terms of academic writing? We'll pick that up again because these things are specific to Swansea in our case. And then looking at this slide, there's a word here that you might not be familiar with. Excuse me, in Swansea we use Canvas. So that's where you submit your assignment to Swansea. That's where I post messages through. For example, some other universities use Moodle, which is the similar but slightly different, and some use Blackboard. So when you see any information that says information will be on Moodle, realistically in the Swansea context, it means Canvas. Okay. So again, all of you in the module then will have done a previous module, and this works in the same way. So there will be those weeks which are kind of self-supported asynchronous study weeks, and I will post messages on Canvas every week to know what the aim of this week, if you get the chance to do so, is to look at such and such. And we will have sessions that we will build a timetable together as to when we will meet as a Swansea cohort as well. So some weeks it'll be totally asynchronous. In other words, you just work your way through the information that's on PebblePad like you've done in your previous module. And then there will be other weeks where we'll still be doing that, but we'll have a session that kind of replicates this evening, where anyone who's able to can pop along, ask questions, come along, have a virtual cup of tea together and just a bit of a chat and try and feel that we're kind of part of a cohort. And then, as we've had before, there will be the 2 national conference Saturdays. And we've got quite a bit of time realistically before these 2 conference Saturdays kick in. So the first one isn't until the 21st of June. So we got just over a month before the first one. And the second one then comes round a little bit quicker, which is the 12th of July. So realistically, the first national conference Saturday the 21st of June, we will be focusing upon core strand 1 and core strand 2 of the module. So there's quite a lot of time up front to kind of work your way through the materials relating to those core strands. And then the second Saturday looks at core strand 3 and core strand 4. And then the other date I wanted to make you aware of, I'll pick it up again later on, but the date for submission of the assignment. And this again is quite far in the distance, but it'll come round really quickly. And it's also very similar, if not the same, as the ARES module, which is Thursday, the 28th of August. So we've got quite a lot of time before our first Saturday. Second Saturday comes round a bit quicker. We're then heading towards the end of your kind of teaching term in school. We're into the summer holidays, we're enjoying a break, and then at the end of it, oh hell, the assignment is due in next week, and that comes round quite quickly. So again, as we go through, we'll kind of work out where and when would be best opportunities to meet as a cohort and have those kind of assignment practice and discussion sessions as well. Okay. So any questions so far? If you're happy, I will pick up on questions later on. We'll ignore that for now. I think we've done that before we started recording. So what does the assignment for this module look like? Okay, so what you're asked to do for this module is to critically evaluate the provision for ALN in your current setting and develop an action plan to overcome barriers to inclusive practice. And this assignment comes in 2 parts. It will be submitted all on one Word document. And what I would say, this isn't very technical, but you've got a righty bit at the start, which is 2,500 words. And then you've got a presentation, which is 12 minutes in length, and it's seen as being equivalent to the remaining 1,500 words. Okay, so we've left the wording on the assignment title quite open so that it's set in. So realistically, people on the module across Wales, we've got people in primary, people in secondary, people in special or alternative provision, people who work for the local authority, people who work for education improvement services. So the context of the assignment is very much based on reflecting upon how things are going in your particular setting. Okay, so it's a critical evaluation of provision, and I would say this is kind of on a whole school basis. And now the title of this module is ALN Excellence in Practice. Although we've got this word here, barriers, what I would suggest realistically for this assignment, rather than thinking about, you know what, in my setting, I think this is going really badly, or in my setting, we're rubbish at doing this, I wouldn't take that approach. Realistically, what I would suggest you think about is, you know what, in our setting, we're doing this, and at the moment, it's quite good, or it's good, but we can do better than good. So what's kind of going well? And how might we be able to take it from good to excellent? And what might be some of the challenges and barriers in being able to do this? So at the moment in my school, I think we're doing a really good job in relation to this. So I'm going to pick an example. In my school, I think we are doing a really good job in terms of developing one-page profiles as a part of a person-centered practice. But there is always room for improvement. So why do I think that's going well at the moment? But what could we do as a school to make that better or make it excellent? So I would say that's the type of approach that you're looking at. Starting off, what's positive, but what could be better, rather than going, this is rubbish and we need to fix it. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. And I think that comes across a bit clearer on this next slide. Okay, so part one, this is the 2,500 word righty bit. It asks you to identify effective practices in your setting for whole school inclusive approaches. So as we said, in other words, things that are already good or they are effective, and what can we do to make them better? But what might be the barriers or obstacles that you'd have to get over to make it better? So in my school, this is going well. It could be better. The barrier is we don't have enough staff that are sufficiently trained to further embed it across the school. This is going well, but the challenge is a lack of resource. Therefore, we would need further funding or further people to be able to go from good to better, as kind of a brief example. And one thing that has over the last few years caused a little bit of stress is this word audit. Okay, now when we think about the word audit, potentially we're thinking about Estin coming into school and auditing your practice. We're thinking perhaps about somebody walking around your setting with a clipboard and ticking things off. That word is a little bit misleading, I would say. Okay, so there is no expectation in the assignment that you have to carry out an audit. There is no expectation that you have to go to the head teacher and ask them for data about something. There is no expectation that you have to go and question staff about what they think is going on or why they're doing it. So audit, I would say, if you think about that as reflecting upon, from your own personal point of view, reflecting upon what do you think is going well in your school in relation to inclusion, and what could be done to make it better, what support might be needed to make it better, but what are the challenges that are there. So hopefully that makes a bit more sense, and I'll stop sharing the PowerPoint in a moment and I'll show you some information I've posted on Canvas, and that might make it a bit more clear. Okay, so we're thinking about, do you know what, in my setting, I think this is going well. But going well is fine, but it's not excellent. So what could we as a setting do to go from good to great or good to excellent? What might we need to help us do that? What are the barriers or obstacles that I can think of? And how as a school might we be able to overcome those? So that's quite a lot to think about in only 2,500 words realistically. And I'll go through the assignment brief in a bit more detail later on. And realistically, it says you can pick either 1, 2, or 3 elements of practice. So if you've got one area of practice, you've got about 2,000 words that you can have that discussion in. If you pick 2 examples of good practice, then obviously that word count is cut in half and you've got about 1,000 words for each one. If you pick 3 examples, then you're down to about 680 words for each one. Okay, now whether you pick 1, 2, or 3, there is no advantage or disadvantage from either approach. Either approach will get you to the end, but it'll look slightly differently. So you could argue if I pick on one approach, then I can go into it in more depth. If I pick 2 or 3 approaches, then I can think about practice more widely across the setting. But from what I've seen over the last couple of years, people have done all sorts of different combinations of those, and it hasn't had an impact in terms of the mark the assignment has been able to achieve. So it's kind of a bit of a personal choice, realistically. You know your setting. few weeks or few months' time, when you start to think about this in a bit more detail, you will be guided by, do you know what, I know I can talk 2,000 words on one particular thing. Or maybe there's two things I think we should talk about, and I will split my word count equally. And as I said earlier on, we will spend some time later in the module working out when would be a good timetable to meet up and have these discussions. We can talk through those things then. So that's the first part. Technical term audit. Realistically, have a think about what's going well in your school and what could be done to make it better. So if you think back, those of you who did the inclusive classroom practice module, your assignment asked you to think about what was going well in your personal practice, or what was going well in your particular classroom. This is asking you to think now, not you personally, but practice whole school approaches. Okay, so that's the first part. Second part is an online presentation. So realistically, this will be a recorded PowerPoint. And again, we'll talk through closer to the time, how do I do that? Okay, so could you do some kind of session like I'm doing now? You set up a Teams meeting, you're the only person that's in it, you share your PowerPoint on screen and you record yourself talking. That's one way of doing it. Equally, you can just use the record presentation function that's built into PowerPoint. Other people have used things like Canva, for example, so a different kind of platform, similar to PowerPoint. Again, there's no right or wrong way of doing it necessarily. So in your presentation, you will be asked to outline the findings that you've talked about in the first part. So kind of a brief recap. This was the practice that I identified as being effective, but could be improved. And what you're asked to think about more in the presentation is, how do you overcome the barriers that are there? So if you've identified, to know what, our everyday universal provision is quite good, but there are particular groups of learners who maybe are not getting the support that they need. What might be the barriers that are there already to explain why it's not quite as successful as it could be? And as a school, how do we overcome those barriers? So if part one is asking you to focus more on what practice is good and why is it good and why is that important, and to start to think about the barriers, part two is asking you to briefly recap the good practice, but to focus more on the barriers and overcoming the barriers to it. So hopefully that makes sense. And as I said, this will be a 12-minute plus or minus 10% time. So it's a 12-minute recorded presentation, which is equivalent to 1,500 words. So my expectation for this, you will do a PowerPoint, you will write a script for yourself. You don't need to submit the script, but realistically, you can read through your script as you go through the different slides on your screen, and then you submit the presentation as a link embedded in the document. Okay, so there's quite a few technical bits there that do crop up. We'll go over those later, but for now, hopefully that gives a bit of an introduction to what you're going to be doing. So 2,500 word written assignment realistically, and then a 12-minute, 1,500 word equivalent recorded presentation. And as I said, I will work through an example with you in a short time. Now, going back to part one, the audit, 2,500 words. The first 500 words will be introducing your setting. So the setting that's being reflected upon is a 500 pupil 4 to 11 primary school based in South Wales. Within our school, our motto is such and such. We have 26% of our learners who are EAL, another 15% who are ALN, and 45% of our learners are entitled to free school meals. this sets the context of the school that we're in. So those of you who did the inclusive classroom practice module, that's going to sound quite similar really to the introduction for that assignment. And there will be some unavoidable crossover in terms of that. So basically you're telling me as the reader who doesn't work in your setting, where do you work without naming it? What type of setting is it? What's your role within the setting? As your role is quite important in terms of underpinning and informing your reflection on what's going well. And then it'll ask you to give a bit of an ethos of the school in terms of ALN and inclusion generally. The second part then is where you've got the 2,000 words to go through and think about what's going well, why is that important, and how could it be made better. Now on the slide here it says you might find it useful to record your audit on the grid below. I'm quite conscious that there isn't a grid below, but I'll show you where that is on Canvas when I stop going through this PowerPoint. And it mentions in there, for example, you will be setting yourself, or you're setting more correctly, some SMART targets in terms of going from good to excellent. Okay. Second part, then we said this was the presentation, 12 minutes roughly. Quick overview, a quick summary of what you kind of found in your 2,500 word written bit. Then you're asked to think about what are the key challenges to making changes on a whole school level. What might be some of the skills or actions or strategies that are needed to support that change? So do you know what, in my school, I think we're doing this quite well, but I know the teachers are very embedded in that one approach. To make things excellent, there might be another approach that we could add on to what we're already doing. One of the challenges might be changing teachers' mindsets. Therefore, a key skill or action would be training, which could include observing practice or something like that. Okay. And in your presentation, you are limited in terms of the number of slides that you're allowed to use. So it does say between 4 and 8 slides. However, you can also have an extra slide, which is your kind of front cover or your kind of title slide. So this is my presentation, and over the next slides, I'm going to tell you about. And then you are also allowed to have a reference slide at the end. But the key content bit of your presentation will be supported by between 4 and 8 slides. Okay, so you could have 4 slides with an extra slide at the front, which is introducing you and your presentation, and another slide at the end, which is your reference list. Okay, so that's the second bit. I'll go on to this bit. This is the marking criteria. Okay, so what is it that you're going to be marked upon? Where will the marks be awarded, and how do these link to the learning outcomes for the module? Now, there's no expectation at this point that you've had any time to take a look at the module handbook or what's up on Canvas or PebblePad, for example, but there are 4 learning outcomes for this module. Part 1 of the assignment is worth 20% of the mark, so that audit. Part 2, the action plan, which will come in terms of how you might start to overcome the challenges. It's worth 20%. Part 2, the presentation, thinking about the challenges and barriers that are there, 20%. And then thinking about the skills or strategies that might be needed to get people on board with or upskilling people, is 20%. And then that leaves us final 20%. So this is quite a big chunk of the mark realistically in terms of what's been called clarity of exposition and accuracy with reference to grammar, syntax and spelling. So a more simplistic way of saying this, I suppose, 20% of the assignment is based on your academic writing and whether the references you've used are appropriate, whether there's enough of them, and whether they've been cited and referenced correctly. So 80% of the mark is based on the content, 20% of the mark is based on how you've written it. So hopefully that makes sense. And then we've seen this slide before. In other modules, you get a maximum of 2 attempts per module. Mark in the 50s is a pass, in the 60s is a merit, 70s is a distinction. And as we said, right at the very end of the summer holidays, there might not be a holiday much at the end, August the 28th, by 1 minute to midnight is when this assignment is due in. And I think that either is the same date or is at least very close to the ARES module as well. So one of the things we will think about as we go through is kind of workload and making sure you've got enough time to spread yourself between the 2 modules. Okay. I'll come back to that slide later. Does anybody have any questions at the moment? Not always easy to ask those when we're recording, but maybe there's something that will crop up in a bit. So that's a very whistle-stop tour looking at that kind of generic PowerPoint. I'm going to stop sharing at this point, try and work out what button I need to press to show you the other thing I wanted to show you, and hopefully that will explain a bit more some of what I've gone through with you. Okay, so I can see you on screen, Agnes. Are you happy to just give me a nod that the slides have changed? Awesome, thank you very much. So what I've got on here then is what the Canvas site looks like currently. Okay, so I've set this up so this replicates student view. It looks a little bit different for me when I go into it as a tutor. It gives me more links I can click on to upload stuff and things like that. So hopefully this is what the module on Canvas at Swansea looks like when you go in. So there's a few things that I just wanted to mention. The first one is if we click on course overview, hopefully this is changing in real time on screen. Got there some information about what the module aims are. So realistically, we're thinking a little bit about the strategic role of the ALN Co. We're thinking a little bit about effective partnership working. So that could be working internally, so staff in the school working in partnership with each other, but we could also broaden that out a bit more in terms of our learners, parents, external agencies that might be involved, for example. We're evaluating whole school practice, interventions and strategies to support inclusion. Doesn't specifically say ALN, so that opens up further avenues that you might want to talk about. So I know some of you in the module, your expertise relies very much upon EAL. And as people have said, EAL isn't necessarily an ALN, as is noted in the ALN Code for Wales, but it does mean you could talk about practice in relation to EAL because it's related to inclusion. We could also be talking about whole school strategies to support well-being or belonging or conniving, for example, in terms of inclusion. So I just wanted to kind of get that point across realistically that although the module has got ALN in the title, when we're talking about inclusion, inclusion means everyone, and not everyone has an ALN. So you can make this specific to your context and the context of your school. And then again, we're going back, I suppose, and we're kind of critiquing inclusion and what that might mean across a whole school setting. Okay, so if we scroll a little bit further down, you will see I have put up a brief handbook. So I've put an English version and a Welsh version, and this sometimes is quite useful to refer back to. So one of the challenges we have on this course potentially is some of the information you get comes from Swansea, some of the information you get is national, and where do I find the bits that I need to look at? So I've just put a quick guide on there. This is what's on PLP. So when you go into PebblePad through your Workbase account, this is what's on there compared to what's on in Swansea, and this is how I get onto PLP if I've forgotten or potentially not been on there before. Now, I've deliberately not put a timetable on as yet, because over the next few weeks, as we get going with the module, what I'd like to do is give you as a group the opportunity to tell me what works best for you. And very often we end up with what's the least worst option for people rather than what's the best option that works for everyone. But I'd rather you as a group tell me what days and times work best. And then what I'll try and do is put a timetable for us together, which either means it works for most people most of the time, or to know what we might need to mix and match the days. So maybe the first day we meet could be a Tuesday, but the second meeting might be on a Thursday. So the aim is to try and make sure that everyone at least has got an opportunity if they want to. And then I've also put some information on there, the assignment brief and the marking rubric. I've put a link to the cover sheet that you will attach to the end, and I've also put in there what's called an acceptable use of Gen AI statement. Okay, now there can be some concern sometimes. Am I allowed to use AI in terms of helping me with the assignment? And if I am, what am I allowed to use it for? I won't dwell on that this afternoon, but we will pick this up again. But realistically, if you want to know whether you can use AI, the answer is yes. And I would say it might be helpful in terms of finding readings that could be useful. It might be helpful in terms of thinking about setting out a structure for your assignment. I think that's perfectly acceptable. Would I suggest you use it to write your assignment? I would say no, and we're probably in a bit of a tricky area there. And there's all sorts of reasons why I would suggest that, including Gen AI isn't very inclusive, very good at sharing certain voices over others, and probably is not going to get you as high a mark as it would do if you do the assignment yourself. Okay, but pick up on that again. So just wanted to kind of show that that was there, and then I'm going to click on modules. And you've all seen this type of dashboard before. You can see on here, as I've done with the other modules, those of you who've had modules with me before, I've put on a week and kind of the date the week starts on, and every week I will post an overview and to-do list. So it might be, do you know what, this is this week's, and I've just kind of put this is the point of this week, and this is what I suggest you do during the week. So I will replicate that going through each week. These are just a case of, do you know what, I'm not sure what I've been doing. I've looked at that, and do you know what, I said this week I might be looking at course strand 2. So it's just to kind of give you an idea as to where you could or should be up to. Okay. And then if we go back to the modules bit, I just wanted to draw your attention to these pages here, where what I've done is to try and give a bit more information to unpick what the assignment might look like. So if I just show you some of these pages, realistically, what's on this first page very much is what was on that PowerPoint that we've just gone through. I've put a link here to the marking rubric and the assignment brief. And if we think back to the PowerPoint, there was a phrase that said it would be helpful to use the grid below, and then there wasn't a grid. Okay, the grid is built into that assignment brief, and I will show you what it looks like in a moment. Okay, so over the next few weeks, this is what we're working towards. I'll ask you as a group to tell me what days and times would work best, and then I will populate in this bit here the days and times of the sessions that we will meet up on. Okay, so I'm just going to move that bit so that I can see the next button. On this page then, what I've done is to try and go through that assignment evidence in a little bit more detail. So we saw part 1, audit, sounds quite technical. Realistically, you're reflecting on what do I think is going well in school. 500 words telling me where you work, what's your role within it, and what does your school do in terms of inclusion. And then the 2,000 words that are left is going through and unpicking what's working well, but what could go from effective to excellent. Hopefully that makes sense. So as I've noted there, you've got 2,000 words. You can talk about one area and use the whole 2,000 words to do that. Pick on 2 areas and follow the same structure through for both, but it gives you 1,000 words each. Or you could pick 3, which gives you about 670, 680 words roughly. Okay. Now, I did say earlier on, there is no one approach that's more successful than the other in terms of getting marks for this assignment. And the only time I would say where I've seen this go a little bit wrong is where somebody has tried to fit 3 themes in. They've gone into much greater depth for theme 1 and 2, and then they've just been left with a couple of 100 words to think about theme 3. So if you're going to do 3 themes, I would say think about being roughly equal in terms of your word count between them. So I'm going to do 1,000 words on theme 1, I'm going to do 700 words on theme 2, and I'm going to do 300 words on theme 3. That probably wouldn't go down that well. So if you've got that discrepancy between the words, I would kind of look at it and go, well, actually, would I be better off in focusing on 2 themes? So hopefully that makes sense. So what sort of themes could you be looking at in terms of inclusion? So I've just put some examples on here. So you could be looking at person-centered practice. You could be looking at partnership working to support inclusion. You could be thinking about your universal learning provision. So our whole school offer to learners is pretty good. Or you might be thinking more about, you know what, our targeted learning provision or our additional learning provision, I think, is going quite well at the moment. Or you might be thinking about things like graduated response to learning. So we've got a wide range of strategies and responses that we work through, and they are responsive to learners' needs. Or, do you know what, one of the things I think is really good about the school is as staff, we're all on the same page and we've got a really clear, consistent understanding of what inclusion might be. Okay, so those, as I said, are just examples. Now, the grid that says you could fill in realistically asks you to reflect upon practice under these 5 different headings. Okay, so what is going well? So here you might be putting into that first column attitudes and understanding of staff. The rationale bit is looking at why is that practice considered important? So if you've mentioned something that you think is going well in your school, why is it important that that practice is good or effective? It then asks you to unpick your choice a little bit further. So you've said it was effective. Why? So what is it you think shows the strengths of that practice? But it's effective, not excellent. So it could be made better. So what might be the weaknesses or the bits that could be tweaked? The next bit is asking you to think about setting a target. So we're currently effective, but we want to take this to excellent. What's the target I would set to ensure that we can get there? And it's suggested in the guidance that you use a SMART target, but the spirit of this assignment is talking about inclusion. Therefore, I think it's a challenge to force everyone to do a SMART target if you don't want to, but target setting in some way. And then you begin to think about some of the next steps to be able to make that change. So this is what's going well. This is why this is important in practice. This is what is going well in what I've identified, but here are the bits that could be better. To make it better, this is the target I'm going to set. And thinking about why we need to make it better. What I've done here, expanding the table, hopefully expands a little bit more on what it is that you're going to have to put into those columns. Okay, now when you're filling in the template or the grid, I would say realistically use this in terms of making notes for your planning. Realistically, you're going to be writing 2,000 words underneath these headings. That's going to look quite clumsy if you put it into a grid. So when it comes to writing the assignment itself, I would say use the column headings as headings to structure your discussion around, but rather than writing it in a table, just write it as text, as you normally would. But the table or the grid, I think, is quite helpful for you to make notes on in terms of your planning. Now, I have seen somebody who submitted their 2,000 words in a table, and it was fine, didn't impact on the mark at all, but they found it a struggle. Okay. And then underneath that, I've tried to give, without putting words into your mouth or without putting words into your fingers when you're typing this up, this is what this might look like in practice. Okay, so we've got the headings. So evidence of effective practice. So within my setting, one example of practice viewed as effective relates to the sharing of person-centered practice. The evidence of this effective area of practice comes from. So what's the evidence that you've had that you think is effective? So it could be there's a policy document, or you've got access to some data, or there might be an ESTIN report that's been quite recent that's picked this up as being good practice. Or it might be something a little bit less tangible. So do you know what? I've had conversations with parents. I've observed this whilst working with teachers in various classrooms. The rationale. So why is this area of practice important? So person-centred practice was noted by Welsh Government as being of great importance in supporting learners, including those with ALN, and the importance of this has also been reflected by the ALN Code for Wales, and you could expand that a little bit further. What are the identified strengths and the weaknesses? So as noted in the setting, there is evidence of effective practice. For example, individual IDPs and one-page profiles are accessible online to all members of staff, and they are regularly reviewed. Linking back here to literature now, somebody from literature suggests that such practice should be viewed as effective because if all staff have access to one-page profiles, it is more likely that staff will be able to see them and be better informed as to how to support the children in their classroom. And then thinking about the second bit, although there is evidence of effective practice, there are still some areas that could be further developed. For example, it's become evident when talking to the ALNCO that although the IDPs are available, not all staff are accessing them. So why not? Is it because they don't know where they are, or is it because they don't have the time to do it? Or is it because they think they know better and they don't want to do it? Okay. Then got a kind of a paragraph setting out what we mean by a SMART target. And then I've started to introduce here, thinking about the next steps, what that might look like. So quite a bit to take on board this evening, but as I said, this is what you're going to be looking at in terms of 1, 2, or 3 examples of good practice in your setting, but practice that could still become excellent. That is the approach that you're going to work through. Now, I realise I've just been pointing at the screen for the last 10 minutes and you can't see me pointing at it, so I'll stop doing that. But if you kind of take a look at that, hopefully that makes sense. When you look at the assignment brief, which was on the previous page, it gives you an example of that template being filled in with an answer. So the template example in the brief kind of goes, I've picked universal provision, and it kind of shows you the kind of the pointers that you might want to think about in discussing it. Hopefully that will give you a bit more information or a bit more of a structure as to how to set your answer out. Okay, so use the table or the grid to make notes for yourself to inform the assignment, but when you're writing the assignment, fitting 2,000 words into that table is quite clunky. Just use the subheadings and write your answers underneath. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm just going to share the next page with you as well. And before you fall asleep and before my voice goes, I just want to go through what the presentation advice is. So first part, we've gone through 2,500 words. Tell me in your school what's going well, but what could be made better, and what might be the steps that we would go through to make it better. The presentation now then, as we said, is a 12-minute PowerPoint presentation. It's equivalent to 1,500 words. Doesn't mean there are 1,500 words on the PowerPoint. It doesn't mean the script that you're going to be making for yourself is 1,500 words long, but it's equivalent. Okay, so the presentation will be a set of PowerPoint slides. You've got 12 minutes to present, plus or minus 10% of the time. Now, being quite pedantic, what does that mean in reality? So your presentation is fine if it's between 10 minutes 48 seconds and 13 minutes 12 seconds in length. So there's a bit of leeway there. If your presentation is 9 minutes long, then the feedback could be, I'm going to pick on Agnes because I can see you on my screen, Agnes, to know what, Agnes, your presentation was really good. However, you had 3 minutes left in the presentation, which means you could have gone through some of these areas in more depth. Or, again, picking on Agnes, Agnes, know what, your presentation was 27 minutes long. It was far too long, therefore there would be some kind of penalty in terms of going over the word count equivalent. So 12 minutes is relatively strict, but there is that kind of leeway either side. You will need to be visible on screen in your presentation, and you also need to be audible. But it is fine to read off a script that you have prepared. You're not expected to kind of make it up and talk your way through it as you go along. And as I said, it is important that you are visible on screen so that we know that it's you. It's fairly obvious that it's you with your voice, but you need to be seen on there as well. Okay. Now, as I said, you could decide to use the record button in function, the record function in PowerPoint. If you do that and you know how to use PowerPoint, and it'll ask you to turn the camera on and you come up as a little thumbnail image at the bottom of the screen. Or, like I said, you could open up a Teams meeting for yourself or a Zoom meeting for yourself, share the PowerPoint on screen like I did earlier on, and basically talk through as if you were presenting in a meeting. Either way is fine. Now, what does your presentation have to cover? So 3 things. Part A, a general overview of the findings from the audit. So basically a quick recap of what you covered in part 1. Second bit, so part B and part C are new realistically. Part A, recapping what the audit has already done. Part B and Part C are building on it. So Part B, an analysis of the key challenges to the whole setting approaches. So we could be thinking about literature here generally. Do you know what? Generally, literature says that it's quite difficult to get everyone in the school on board doing the same things consistently. And then you could refer back then to going back to your setting. What are the specific challenges that might be in place where you work? And then the third part, Part C, asks you to reflect upon the skills and actions or the strategies needed to engage and challenge stakeholders to be able to make those changes. So hopefully that makes sense. So who are the key stakeholders? What needs to be done or in place to get people to change? So we're all people. That's a stupid thing to say, but I was going somewhere. We're all people. We know what it's like to work with people in settings. We know there are some people that are more adaptable and flexible or quicker to get on board with change. We know that there are people who are very reluctant or very resistant to make change. So who might be some of the key people involved in making changes? What are the challenges in terms of getting them on board? And what might be effective approaches to get them on board? So hopefully that makes a bit more sense. Now, as a very rough guide, as I said, you've got 12 minutes for your presentation. This is guide rather than set in stone, but how might you want to use your 12 minutes? So I would say potentially 30 seconds roughly to introduce the presentation. So, welcome to my presentation. Over the next 8 slides, I'm going to be talking through how effective practice in my school can become excellent, and the barriers and challenges in place and the skills and strategies needed to engage and challenge stakeholders. You're then going to go into your presentation properly, and I would say 2.5 to 3 minutes maximum in terms of going back and giving a summary of what you'd covered in part 1. These were the areas that were identified as being effective and why. I would then say 4.5 minutes to talk about key challenges to whole setting approaches. So generally, and then more specific in your setting. And then 4.5 minutes, what are the skills and strategies we need to engage stakeholders generally? What strategies might we need to use to engage the specific key stakeholders in my setting? And then if you've got a few seconds left, you might go, thank you for listening to the presentation. This final slide shows my reference list. Okay, so as I said, general rough guidance. You might get part A done in 2 minutes, which means you've got an extra minute to share between part B and part C. So the key thing I'm trying to get across, I suppose, is because part B and part C isn't covered in isn't covered in the audit, the first part of the assignment, you would be better off using the majority of your time discussing those areas in the presentation rather than spending more of your time recapping what you've already done. Hopefully that makes sense. So I'm going to stop sharing at that point. And then I'm going to do a final share if I can pick the right button. Okay, so Agnes, can you give me a nod if that's shared? Perfect, thank you very much. So just to kind of go back and go, I said earlier on that the assignment brief was on Canvas. This is what the assignment brief looks like when you open it up. This is the English medium version. There is a Welsh medium version of it as well. go through realistically what it was we've just mentioned. But there's an example of that grid or template where someone's kind of put in the notes to themselves about what they were going to talk about. And then, as I said, what I shared with you on Canvas was a bit more detail in terms of how to expand on those. So I just wanted to kind of share that with you so that you've all got an idea of where that information is. So looking at the time, I'm conscious now that I've spent the last 56 minutes of your life talking at you. So I will stop sharing. I will stop recording at that point.